I guess the sort of area where Derrida comes in is Husserl had this idea of language. Basically, he, like so many philosophers, believed that the spoken word is better than the written word. That's in Plato, it's in Rousseau, it's in virtually every philosopher. They will say that the spoken word is closer to the truth.
Yeah, it
And
wasn't isn't well, like Socrates supposedly famous or infamous, depending on how you look at it, for saying that, you know, the written word is going to corrupt people and make us all dumb because we won't remember anything anymore.
that's right, yeah. Which people say about Wikipedia and so forth now, don't they? That we won't
Yeah,
remember anything.
yeah.
So yeah, it's I've completely forgotten which of Plato's books it's in, and people will be yelling at the screen. But he, the written word is wrong for several reasons. It can escape us. Derrida was really fascinated in this. When I write something down, it goes out of context and someone can read it completely wrong. So that's one thing. And Plato, through Socrates, describes it as something like the father is not there to look after it. This child goes out in the world and the father's not there. Now you can imagine psychoanalysts have had a lot of fun with that sort of stuff.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
so there's that aspect of it. But it was also just seen as, well, I think it was Aristotle, I might be wrong. Aristotle basically draws up the scheme where he says you have the thought in your head, and that's pure, and that's true, and that's good. You then turn it into words in your mouth, and that's already slightly corrupted because it's not capturing things absolutely right, but it's not too bad. I, who's having the thought, then speak the words. You, who's listening to it, hear those words. You understand absolutely what I mean. All of the words make sense to you. They go into your ear, and then once it's in your ear, it goes into your brain, and the thought that I had here is transferred absolutely perfectly to your brain. So that's the ideal
Wow.
of language. You didn't say it always happened, or indeed maybe never happened, but that's the ideal. So everything that's not that is not as ideal. So again, if I have the thought in my head and rather than putting it into words, I then write it down rather than speaking it, I'm getting even further away from the soul. The soul, basically, me talking is my soul talking, in lots of ways. And so I'm corrupting it on a whole different level. So
Wow, that language of corrupting it is
yeah,
so,
absolutely.
like, that's so moralistic.
Yeah, absolutely. There were some thinkers who Derrida had some massive arguments with, particularly a guy called Searle. But he was a disciple of Austin, and Derrida thought Austin was really interesting. Austin wrote a book called How to Do Things with Words, which is a really interesting title. So it's it looks at the way that words act in the world rather than just being transparent conveyors of meaning. They can act. If I say I declare you man and wife, I have by those words done an action. There's another example where if we're in a room and I say, gosh, it's cold in here, and you're sitting next to an open window, that is me telling you to shut the window, please. Okay, so words can do actions. That's an example of phatic speech, which isn't quite Austin, but it's still there or thereabouts. Um, so so they kind of, in order to have that, particularly Searle, they needed to think that language could be transparent in the same way that Socrates did. So they describe things like literature, theatre, jokes. I think most of language as being corrupted. That it wasn't a pure thing. Me saying go and sit on that chair is pure language. It's understandable, explicable. That's language. Me saying, me telling a joke, isn't. It's a completely different thing. And Derrida had real problems with this because he thought all language did the same thing, basically. But just to go back a step, so this whole history of philosophy, basically, and it crops up in weird places, like Rousseau says that speech is better than writing, despite the fact that he says it while he's writing his confessions, which he says his confessions are the only things the way he can speak his soul. Plato, who argues against writing down and argues against the poets and argues against theatre, sets everything he does up as dialogues. It's basically theatre and poetry and so on. And so, but for whatever reason, philosophers always come back to this thing that writing is worse than speech, and this is a huge part of Derrida, where Derrida tried to overturn that that dialectic, that dichotomy. Sorry. So Husserl does it as well. Husserl says you've got this pure thing in your mind and put it into words, no good. Put it into writing, worse. And Husserl actually goes so far as to say that actually the voice in your head that you're listening to now when we're not speaking, that voice is you. That's the pure soul. That's who you are. Now, there's various objections to that. You know, when I'm speaking, in fact, and I may have said this in last time we were talking, when I'm speaking, I'm not having the thoughts before I speak. I have no idea what I'm about to say next. I can speak absolutely cogently. I can stumble and fumble, but I can also speak absolutely cogently and say things like I can speak absolutely cogently without at any time me thinking I can speak absolutely cogently as the next thing I'm thinking of. And of course, Freud has had lots to say about this sort of stuff. Most speech, we are just riffing. We're going. You know, I find it very hard to actually think of a time when I've sat down, thought these are the words I'm going to say, and this is what I will say. You know, maybe giving a speech or something. And when we're having a conversation, you and I, we are taking each other to different places in conversation. I'm having thoughts I would not have if I wasn't talking to you. You're having thoughts you would not have if you weren't talking to me. I'm saying things like I'm having thoughts I would not have, which is a sentence I would never say unless we were having this conversation. So all of those things. So Husserl is wrong, but Derrida catches him out. Because in this book, Origin of Geometry, Husserl says something like, how do we make sure words keep their meaning? And he says, and it's one paragraph, and it's a very Derrida thing to do. We'll take a huge book and go, there's a paragraph that's really interesting because it contradicts the main thing that this guy says. And Husserl says, well, of course, the way we make sure that the word lion, talking about, you know, big cats, the word lion, the way we keep the meaning of that is we write it down. And Derrida goes, aha, hang on. You've been saying that purity of language involves not writing it down. You've written this down.
Yeah. Why did you write it down then?
Exactly. And the example I think Derrida gives, or maybe a secondary text of Derrida says, okay, so say I'm Einstein and I think of E equals mc squared. Okay, I've thought of it. Great thought. Terrific. So I tell a few of my mates, E equals mc squared. I show you the proof, blah, 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 describe it all for you. That's all great. But then I go to sleep, I forget it the next day, or I'm hit by a bus. A couple of other people I've told forget it. All of these things. E equals mc squared. If that's going to spread throughout the universe, there's only one way to do that, to write it down. And this is what science has always done. And this, of course, is what philosophy has always done. Philosophy, this great thing that's arguing against written word, it's been written down. And for Derrida, this was kind of the eureka moment where he went, hang on, there is a massive contradiction here in Husserl. He didn't disrespect Husserl. He still thought Husserl was fantastic. And, you know, Derrida still describes himself as a phenomenologist throughout his life. But he saw this massive contradiction that in fact, writing for Husserl in this paragraph, despite everything Husserl had said, was the way that meaning is guaranteed, was the way that meaning can be spread around. And he didn't, and for Derrida, there was no corruption that happens in writing that doesn't happen in speech. You know, the whole thing about, you know, that it can be taken out of context. We all know that can happen with speech, obviously. With, you know, exactly the same as writing down. So that was one of Derrida's key insights. And, you know, a lot of his work, particularly in the late 60s, was about the way that language, in a sense, was this idiot bastard child that ran around all over the place. And you know, philosophers' attempts to pin it down were false. You know, and that the way they were doing that falsely was the way they'd done a lot of things falsely, which brings us to kind of the metaphysics of presence, this trust that philosophy has that you can actually pin these things down and examine them in the way that science does. You can strap it down to a board, cut it apart, and look at it. And Derrida said, no, we're just thrown into the mess of life, and we have to try and, in Husserlian terms, describe it and keep describing it in lots of different ways, but never say that we've actually locked in that meaning.